Okay, so much. The first presenter is Scott Emery. Scott will introduce himself as well, but he and Bonadio have worked together for quite some time with MS Hall, and would like to also say at the outset here that each of us on this panel, Ren Kieber, Scott, Carol Tagus, myself, have worked with one another for quite some time, and we will want to continue this effort of moving forward. We were hoping that the 1115 waiver would have been approved by today. Not so likely, but you're going to hear when it will be approved by one or more of our speakers. And I will turn it over to Scott for his presentation. And are you advancing?
Yep, Scott's got control.
Oh, Scott, you got control, so go ahead, bud.
Thank you. So good afternoon. I am Scott Emery from MS Hall & Associates. I'm a partner here at the firm. I oversee our strategy and transformation team. And so I'm happy to be a part of today's presentation to talk about something that we've been talking about all across the state since the concept paper came out back in August of 2021. So what I'm going to talk about today is really just kind of a higher level overview. As Arch was saying, we do have 4 of us, and so we're not going to get to every detail that we would perhaps typically get to in the 25 minutes that I'll be talking. A lot of the conversations that have been taking place across the state have been thinking about where we find ourselves, what are lessons that have been learned, where do we find changes due to public comments that have occurred already, and where we find ourselves right now with the state and the federal government going through negotiations about a lot of these different pieces. So the conversation that we're going to have today is certainly based off of the iterative nature of the 1115 waiver from August of 2021 to present day, where again, negotiations are taking place. I am certainly willing and available to have conversations after the fact because there is an awful lot of content that we won't get to in detail. But as I said, Scott Emery from MS Hall & Associates, excited to be here and talk through these things that we think are going to have a really significant impact here in New York State. So we're going to talk about this 1115 waiver. We'll kind of jump right into where we find ourselves. Essentially, the key takeaways with this, if you're thinking about this and you're taking this information back to your own organization, the state has requested, as of right now, $13.52 billion over a 5-year time frame. The overall goal is seeking to integrate social care and health care into the fabric of the state's Medicaid program. So when we're thinking 1115 waiver, this is a mechanism for the state to redesign how Medicaid is delivered across the state. We'll talk about this in the next few minutes as to how it's differentiated from perhaps what you all experienced previously in the world of DSRIP, the Delivery System Reform Incentive Payment Program. This is not DSRIP 2.0. This is not DSRIP 3.0, if you're familiar with some of those different iterations of what took place there. We as a firm were heavily involved in that world of DSRIP, a lot of different lessons learned. And so what we're thinking about with this is because of what has been accentuated, amplified, and really kind of risen to the top of a level of importance, the things from COVID and the social needs and all the different components of what took place there, lessons learned from DSRIP, the state is really trying to push forward as it has for the last several years and aligning itself with what's been happening at the federal level and across lots of other states. And Ren will talk about some of those details, thinking through this is the direction it wants to go. It's showing its cards once again that overarchingly it wants to integrate social care and healthcare into the Medicaid program. So how is it going to do that? These 4 bullets here are really the 4 goals that the state has. And in today's conversation, we're going to go through all of them rather quickly, but we're going to go through them for the sake of understanding where some of these things find themselves. So that said, the main area of focus with this 1115 waiver is thinking about what's happening in the world of health equity. I've pulled this out as its own separate slide because in the different iterations of the 1115 waiver documentation, there were lots of questions at the public comment phase of this work that had to do with what exactly is health equity? Well, how are we defining that? How is it going to be implemented? What are the different components that we need to be thinking about as it relates to health equity itself? So the state has adopted the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation definition that you see here in front of you. The idea that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible, which requires removing obstacles to health such as poverty, discrimination, and their consequences, including powerlessness and lack of access to good jobs with fair pay, quality education and housing, safe environments, and healthcare. The reason why I want to read through that is that part of the conversation I know that we've been having throughout the entire state for quite some time now about a lot of these things, is that even though this is a healthcare, Medicaid-driven program, things such as health and health equity are not the sole domain of just healthcare. And so the state, in its design of what this is looking to do, again, integrating social and healthcare, some of these different components we'll talk about more later on, but all of these different things are direct or indirect influences and things that are related to health equity. So how do we think about those from a bigger perspective, perhaps, than just healthcare alone, and thinking about what's happening across all of the different communities and regions that we are attending to around social care. So again, why is this happening? Lessons learned from district, things that have taken place because of COVID, trying to address health inequities in ways that are collaborative and in ways that are looking to do things from a regional perspective. So let's get into these 4 different bullets, the goals that the overarching goal is divided into. So first of all, the state wants to move towards building a more resilient, flexible, and integrated delivery system that reduces health disparities, promotes health equity, and supports the delivery of social care. If it's going after that, one of the first big things that this documentation is wants to see come into reality are these things called health equity regional organizations. I'm going to try my best to not speak in too many acronyms, and so I will probably say this in its entirety just for the sake of being clear as to what this is. So these health equity regional organizations are not the PPSs, the performing provider systems of district days. They're very different, and the state's been very clear as to try and differentiate these things. These will be mission-based organizations with a state-designated lead entity that will build a coalition of a variety of organizations that will be regionally focused and that will work to align the health equity needs that differ by community and help develop these future value-based payment contracting structures. So when we think about the HERO, the Health Equity Regional Organization, mission-based, they will have a state-designated lead, which tells us that there will be a procurement process, there will be a mechanism for deciding by the state who or whom the organization or organizations will be leading this. What's this going to look like? How's it going to function? We'll talk about here in a second. But it will be building a variety of organizations coming together for differing perspectives in a region to think about and plan around health equity needs and these value-based payment arrangements for the future of what their region's needs are. So let's talk about these in a little bit more detail. So what does representation and governance look like within this? Really a cross-section, a spectrum of a variety of different types of organizations, all the way down to individuals on Medicaid, caretakers, really wanting to see how can we think about this from a variety of angles in our region as to what health equity, inequity, and the social care needs are, and how do we begin to think about those things together. So the HERO will be bringing all these different groups together for the sake of understanding that we see this and understand what's happening in the world of health equity. And for us, whatever organization type, it feels like the elephant's trunk. For us, it's the hind leg. All together, though, how do we make visible what's actually happening in these regions from the differing perspectives and the strengths that actually brings about? Secondly, thinking about funding and capabilities, these health equity regional organizations, as they have representation from across a variety of different types of organizations and individuals, there will be funds that will be flowing to them in the form of limited planning grants. And that will happen because that will be a main function of trying to think about what do we actually have in front of us and how do they produce a regional annual report on what is actually taking place around health inequities and all the things that we're talking about in a minute with the social determinants of health and whatnot. So thinking about the perspective of this, again, very different than what a PPS was, the Performing Provider Systems of District. Receiving limited planning grants, they will have to receive and ingest data from a variety of different sources. They will assume a necessary regional planning focus to create collaborations and help in the development of a range of VBP models for the sake of what's happening in their region itself. So again, responsibilities, one per year over the course of the 5 years, develop these annual regional plans, utilize data from state-developed uniform social care assessment. There was some conversation in the public comment period about who is developing that uniform social care assessment, and that will be part of what the state will be putting forth, and the heroes will be utilizing that data. Measurement selection, and especially measurement selection stratified by race and ethnicity and optional measures. So that's a newer part based off of where we find ourselves. And again, the ultimate objective of what's happening here is for these heroes, health equity regional organizations, to understand from a diversity of perspective what's happening in its regions around health inequities. So when you think health equity regional organization, think planning, think strategy. They're the ones that will be doing convening and really trying to understand via these annual regional plans what is taking place here as far as the regions that they represent and their concerns. So you've heard me say region probably a dozen times at this point. Part of what has been taking place has been moving more towards these regions, but the understanding of what those regions are has certainly been a little bit up in the air. Back on May 3rd, the state came out with the map that you see in front of you, broken out by regions, by county. As a response to the public comments from September 2nd, the state said, you know what, actually, we are going to hold off on determining what those regions will look like until a further date. So as far as what they could look like, what they will look like, a lot of those different questions are still yet to be seen. Certainly, there are some potential indications of what this map has. There was a previous iteration of this that is substantially different. So again, all to think about, this will be different. The things that we do seem to know though right now is that there will be one region, one hero per region. And so how that continues to flesh itself out via that procurement process, again, it's still yet to be seen. But when you hear me say region, that is yet to be determined, and the hero would be playing a central role in those regions as they are determined. The second entity that the state wants to see come into being within this is called the Social Determinant of Health Network. Now, part of this conversation is around terminology and thinking about, we are calling this in its current form a Social Determinant of Health Network, but you will see things like social care needs, SCNs as an acronym, but you will also see, as you see it on this slide perhaps, thinking about health-related social needs. And so HRSN is the latest iteration of what we're talking about. They seem to be interchangeable, especially when we're talking about social determinant of health network, but we can decipher what some of those things will look like as more documentation and further steps come out. Social determinant of health networks, different than the hero, but working in tandem with it, one per region of the state, again, yet to be determined. They will be a state led by a state designated lead. So again, procurement process, thinking about what does that look like. And they will have a network of community-based organizations that will comprise the entirety of the social determinant of health network itself. One per region. They will collectively use evidence-based interventions, or, as again, a newer portion of this, thinking about the DOH interventions approved on a pilot basis to coordinate and deliver services to address a range of health-related social needs that will improve health outcomes, such as housing instability, food insecurity, transportation, and interpersonal safety. So the SDHN, the Social Determinant of Health Network, will have a lead. It will have a network of CBOs attending to a variety of different health-related social needs. They're going to use existing evidence-based interventions, and the state seems to have left the door open a bit to think about what are these DOH-approved pilot interventions that we can essentially think more descriptively about than prescriptively as far as what that could look like. So again, it represents representation and governance. There'll be a network of CBOs with a state lead. They will be receiving funding. That funding will be direct investments for both the network itself, the social determinant of health network, and individual CBOs for the sake of integration into the network, provision of service, development of infrastructure. It's still yet to be seen as to what these different funds will look like and how they will flow. I know I've probably spoken to a couple thousand people at least about all of this 1115 waiver content over the last year and a half. And there aren't any more details right now about funds flow or how exactly that will work. I do think that what we're looking at, though, again, is a lot more descriptive than it is prescriptive at the moment. And so these responsibilities that the SDHNs will be looking to carry out, formally organize CBOs to perform these interventions. I think it's, again, very interesting that there will be the potential for pilot interventions that take place. And so I think, and I've been saying this for quite some time now, that a lot of the work that I think that is in front of us, and I know that we are already helping in the development of social determinant of health networks, hero development, things along those lines. You hear Scott Emery say these things a lot. How do we meet what the state is saying from the top down? 13.5 billion, heroes, SDHNs, all these different things. How do we meet that from the bottom up? And I think one main way of doing this, of these are the actual needs of our community and our region, and we need to address them in different ways, directly and indirectly. This pilot intervention, barring approval from the state, I think will be a very interesting leverage for us to investigate and think about what's that look like. I think there's an awful lot of work to get done now to begin to identify those things to meet all of this if and when it starts in the near future. So other responsibilities here: coordination of a regional referral network, single point of contracting, and then thinking about advisement around screening for health-related social needs themselves. So again, if you're thinking about the health equity regional organization, the HERO, that is much more planning and strategy, if you will. The social determinant of health network, working in tandem, hand in glove with the HERO, will be much more of the execution and implementation of interventions on an evidence-based and state approval pilot basis. So now we're at our first question. John, am I saying this or are you saying this?
Scott, you can read the question and Danielle will launch it.
Perfect. So, health equity regional organizations are mission-based organizations with a state-designated lead entity that will carry on the exact work of DSRIP, performing provider systems, will be responsible for many regions of New York State, or will build a coalition of a variety of organizations that will be regionally focused in order to align with the health equity needs that differ by community and develop future VBP contracting structures. There's one right answer. I won't tell you what it is, but go for it if you are answering these things for credit. So health-related social.
I'll give you another 8 minutes just as a time check. You should go to 1:30.
Thank you, sir. So we've already talked a little bit about this. Again, the state has continually referenced these different areas of health-related social needs. They have been part of conversation after conversation. They are also very much at the conversation at the federal level. So the state is really aligned with where a lot of these different actions and programs are trying to get to. So if you or your network are attending to these pieces, this is something to certainly be thinking more about, and how you're doing it. What's the network look like? A lot of different questions around those lines. Another part of this puzzle has been ensuring access for criminal justice involved populations. The thing here is looking at some of the different, if you're a nerd like me and thinking about what this is saying, looking at context, all the rest of it, they're looking to build and strengthen relationships between service providers and what's happening, those in the jail and the state prison system here in New York State. This will be phased in over 2 years, looking to do very specific services as it relates to the justice involved populations. Secondly, the state is pushing into the developing and strengthening transitional housing services and alternatives for the homeless and long-term institutional populations. One big thing that has taken place here is that initially this was talking about supportive housing, and that has now changed to transitional housing. This effort will take place through the health equity regional organizations. There will be different measures taken to look at what's happening within the housing gap across New York State. They will develop a transitional housing tool. And if this were to go through as it's being envisioned right now, would be, to my knowledge, the largest housing and Medicaid program in the entirety of the country. And this is also the only bucket of health-related social needs, so food, housing, transportation, all of those. This is the only domain in that health-related social needs area that has its own bucket, its own area of focus. There's nothing like this that's happening for food or transportation or anything along those lines. So if you are in the world of housing, this is something to certainly take deeper dives into. Thirdly, redesigning and strengthening system capabilities to improve quality, advance health equity, and address workforce shortages. This is the only portion of the documentation too that actually begins to get at what's a very, very large issue right now, workforce. So here you will see specific documentation talking about reinvestment in the WIOs, the workforce investment organizations. These funds will target things such as recruitment and retention, developing and strengthening career pathways, training initiatives, expanding community health worker and other related workforce, and then standardizing occupations and job training. Again, there's not a ton of other detail that we have about this portion of the 1115 waiver, but it is directly called out in thinking about how do we make these investments into the workforce in the ways that we need them by region. And then lastly, nothing has certainly emphasized or put on the map COVID as far as telehealth capabilities. So again, thinking about this, the state's going to create an equitable virtual care access fund, looking to do this in a way that continues to bolster telehealth modalities. The list that we have here is a much smaller list than what is in the documentation itself. It seems as though the state has already put together a pretty specific agenda around this, certainly subject to change, but thinking about a lot of different modalities as to what could be taking place for the sake of pushing forward telehealth and other virtual care services. So polling question 2, social determinants of health networks will be comprised of a variety of organizations, mainly clinical in nature. B, consist of a state designated lead, a network of CBOs within each region of the state. Or C, collectively vote on a new name for social determinants of health every 3 weeks. Again, there is a right answer. Best of luck. So in summary, there will be a huge focus on thinking about value-based payment and pushing that into the future. Upwards of 50% of the overall funding right now in a variety of different ways. There will also be, as that is happening, the creation of these things called health equity regional organizations and social determinant of health networks. Focus on the regions, a huge focus on transitional housing, the work around health-related social needs for the sake of health equity, and thinking about how the workforce fits into this. Again, there's an awful lot more detail that I would love to get into, but this is essentially the summation of where this is trying to go and how it's trying to get there as far as weaving and connecting and integrating social care and healthcare here in New York State. So where are we with all of these things? As has already been alluded to, there have been a couple different public comment periods. We find ourselves in the negotiation phase where a lot of these details are being worked out and thought through. As I think Arch said, or at least referred to at the beginning, there was an initial January 1, 2023 target implementation date, which has not been met. And so now we are certainly waiting to see what might be next and what could be a part of this year, perhaps. There's certainly conversation and some speculation around what some of those things could look like as far as a start date, but there hasn't been anything that's been solidified just yet. So thank you very much. I think I even ended a minute early or so, Arch.
Scott, you are my hero. I got to say, you are my hero. Now, you've set the standard for Carol Tagus and Jerry Archibald, both of whom are known to go on a little bit. But thank you. And for those of you that do have questions, address them to all panelists, and we'll do the Q&A at 2:45 or sooner. We encourage your questions. I will say to you all, as Danielle turns the controls over to Carol, that presentation that you just saw was the best presentation that I've seen, not only from Scott, but from anybody else with respect to what this waiver application involves. So again, feel free with each of us that if there are questions that follow this presentation, we're happy to answer them. The questions that are going to be asked today, we will put in a response form. You will get a copy of the slides and access to the recording of this presentation. With that, Carol Tagus, I will not tell you, yes, I will tell you, who I've known for close to 40 years and has been a colleague and was a tremendous influence over DSRIP with being the executive director of the Finger Lakes Performing Provider System. And she is going to describe in a little bit more detail what organizations can do to prepare and how to align yourselves and what the FLIPS role might be in that process as we move forward. So with that, Carol, you are on.
Great. Thank you so much, Arch. Can everybody hear me okay? I
Yes.
presume yes. Great.
Yes.
Well, you just burned up the extra 2 minutes that I was hoping to steal, so thanks very much. I'm a fast
You'll have
talker.
until 2 o'clock, all right?
Okay, all right. So I'm a fast talker, so please put questions in the chat if I go too fast. I want to preface this with, I agree Scott's presentation was excellent. I'm known to steal slides, so I am forewarning you, Scott. I might steal that last summary slide. I thought that was great. As for timing of the waiver, I just wanted to point out, there's always rumors. Every single week there's a different rumor. We have heard over the last couple of weeks that the state is now looking at 4/1. I heard that from a couple of reliable sources. And the state just might do 4/1. However, it will likely be a rolling implementation, starting with the planning grant, just as Scott had said. So I think we've got some breathing room, but don't be surprised if we're surprised, I guess is what I'd like to say. Okay, so let's get moving here. The health equity reform waiver in the Finger Lakes region, shout out to my Finger Lakes partners and friends. We are partnering very strongly, and you may have heard, with Common Ground Health, FLIPS in Rio, in the potential development of a hero. Nothing is formalized or anything. We're just bringing our organizations together along with other partners to make sure that our region is prepared for whatever the waiver is going to look like. We are partnering also with our regional partners, CCSI and United Way, Council of Agency Executives, along with our newly emerging social care networks, Together Now, 360 Collaborative Network, along with many other partners, both clinical and human services and behavioral health. So we've got many people who are talking about this and excited about this. One of the things we want to make sure, though, is to manage expectations along the way, because we've been down that road before. So I want to just repeat that this is a health equity waiver. Every time we kind of get caught up in the details and caught up in the structures and caught up in the money, we tend to kind of forget the original purpose. So this is something that I'm really glad the state has recognized and actually is calling this waiver the health equity reform waiver. And I'm trying my best to make sure that that is front and center in all of the discussions that we have. I also want to say that the waiver is not the end-all be-all solution to all the problems that we have in healthcare. I consider the waiver to be a facilitator, an enabler, an accelerator of much of the work that all of us have been doing for quite a while. So it's not the end-all be-all, it's a path, and we should all take advantage of that path and be prepared. But again, not lose sight of the bigger picture. We don't want to do somersaults and backflips just to draw down dollars, because there are potential dollars available. So I just wanted to preface with that. So this is my version of a summary that many of you have seen before. So there are some slides in here, many of the slides that many of you have seen in different forums. So this is just my version with the strategies. So I don't need to go into that since Scott did such a great job. So let's talk about collaboration and how the region can prepare and how an organization can compare. I do want to use the Finger Lakes region as an example. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we organized ourselves and what we've done in the Finger Lakes region, starting with this quote that I love because, and here's another slide that I stole, this one from Wade Norwood, who does a better job than I do in using this slide. But if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So this is really important in our region. One of the things that we have all committed to in our region is that we do not want to duplicate efforts. We want to leverage all of the assets, infrastructure, expertise, tables that we have in our region, and really be smart and thoughtful about how we go about organizing ourselves and planning, not just for the waiver, but just for the bigger vision for our community, and not just around health. So I wanted to just point that out, that if you're in a different region, this is something that you might want to consider. First, kind of doing a lay of the land. What are the different tables? What are the organizing bodies? Who's who? Who's talking to who? And I think it's just an important place to start in the planning process. So these are some timelines. I'm kind of chunking it in the summer, in the spring, et cetera. So in the summer of 21, I'm not going to go all the way back to the beginning of time, but we do recall back in August of 2021, the conceptual framework came out, and that's when we started looking at what the language says, what does this mean, what are the opportunities, and that's when Common Ground Health and FLIPS started talking much more seriously about collaborating. And we started talking to our regional stakeholders, our shared stakeholders, since we have 13 counties that we share. And then, looking at there we go. And then in the spring of 2022 is when then DOH published the waiver proposal with the initial proposal with a 30-day comment period. We, at that point, started communicating a little bit more formally with the Finger Lakes region stakeholders and our friends at Common Ground Health. Albert Blankley, shout out to Albert, as well as the other Common Ground Health staff members, developed and administered a regional response survey. And we actually worked as a team with these other partners that I referenced in developing this survey and finding out from people, what do you think about this proposal? What do you like? What do you not like? What's missing? We got a lot of feedback, and we collated all of that feedback, and we started summarizing that feedback, and we held a Finger Lakes Region Community Forum. We did an overview of the waiver, we did some Q&A, and then we talked about the survey, and along the way, DOH had their first comment period. So then they had another comment, number 2. By that time, we had collected our survey results, and we decided to review it with the community at our second community forum and talk about what our response would look like, our collective response would look like to DOH. This collective response was pages and pages and pages, and what we wanted to do was reflect what our region said about this waiver, very importantly, prioritizing what that was going to look like. And we were able to get many organizations, I wish I could remember the number now, but all I remember was pages and pages of logos that signed on to this letter, saying to New York State, we as a region want to prioritize these things. This is what we like, this is what we don't like, this is what's missing. At a very high level, there were, just like across the state, comments around not enough focus on children, not enough focus around MCO accountability, not enough focus on many of the things that we have been struggling with since COVID. So that was all summarized, and we submitted it to New York State. Oh, we have a polling question already. Is your organization part of a provider network, primary care IPA, behavioral health IPA, CBO IPA? And when I say CBO IPA, I don't mean a formal IPA, but just a CBO kind of network, or not at all. So that's the question, and I guess somebody else launches it, I hope.
You can keep going, Carol, and you're doing
Perfect.
great.
Thank you. All right. So then in the fall, we notified the Finger Lakes region stakeholders that New York State submitted the final waiver proposal to CMS. All of this is really a lot of hurry up and wait, a little bit of a black hole, hurry up and wait. So we're just going to have to kind of get used to that over the next couple of years. At the time, Common Ground Health and FLIPS met with the New York State Department of Health. We updated them on some of the things that we're doing. They loved, that we had already been kind of bringing ourselves together. We also threw together over a weekend a website, Finger Lakes 1115 Waiver.com or .org. Honestly, I can't remember. It's later on. And just so that we can throw some information out there that all these different presentations, the community forum, slide decks, etc. And then we put the federal comment letter together and then submitted that to CMS, and that was from FLIPS and Common Ground Health. And at that point, we wanted to really narrow down what we were going to say to the federal government. We wanted to say that New York State listened to our feedback. Thank you very much. But here are a few other things that we really wanted to focus on. And so that was a really good process that we followed so that we can make sure that the stakeholders felt that what we're sending back to New York State and the federal government is reflective of what they want to see in the waiver. So here we are in January, and yes, we thought maybe January 1st was going to be the date, but not so much. So we are continuing our planning, our stakeholder engagement. Again, it's a little bit of wait, hurry up and wait. So we will be putting together a newsletter shortly. We did launch a newsletter. It was just kind of like, here we are as kind of a partnership. And another one will be coming out once we get a little bit more details. Once we hear a little bit more from the state, we'll put together another community forum. And I'm really excited that we're partnering with our friends at CCSI and United Way and Council of Agency executives and with input from our community-based organization networks, the United Way Social Services Work Group, as well as Together Now Network and the 360 Collaborative Network to kind of put together and build a CBO kind of capacity planning, a support strategy, and supported by a CBO education series. So we're really kind of looking at input from the CBO space. What are the things that you need? And this is above and beyond the waiver, really. There's so much need right now. And so we thought we'd take an opportunity. Like I said, it's a facilitator, enabler, and accelerator. And I hope somebody's following the chat. I presume somebody is. Okay. Community engagement, basically, like I said, we have an email distribution list that really has been kind of taken over by the newsletter. So those things are going to be kind of combined. We have over 500 people signed up. There it is, fingerlakes1115waiver.org. We will be refreshing it with a more, sophisticated structure. Like I said, right now, we just threw a bunch of stuff up there so that it's readily accessible to our partners. We do stakeholder presentations similar to this as groups are looking for kind of an overview, or even more specifically, like let's talk about housing. So we can do like deep dives on what the proposal says. Remember, all we have right now is a proposal that CMS and New York State are going back and forth on in their negotiations. We'll continue one-on-ones, and we will continue to have our forums. Okay, so, the key success factors and how we're able to do this so far is our commitment to racial equity in our community. There's so many activities that is really important to this space that we also don't duplicate. So we need to leverage all of the racial inequity and diversity, equity, and inclusion activity in our region. So we have a commitment in our region that we really need to leverage and build off of. We have a lot of community engagement. The county, Monroe County, as well as Monroe County counterparts and the rest of the region really are committed to partnering. We've got strong regional planning with our Common Ground Health partners. We have robust existing infrastructure. We've got a great RIO. We've got the planning entity, Common Ground Health. We've got 2 existing closed loop referral networks, the Together Now and 360 collaborative network. And we have in our community a proven track record of innovation with a lot of the work that we've done under DISRIP, as well as Common Ground Health, as well as many of the other pilots and projects that have been going on in our community. Achieving these goals will require meaningful participation by community-based organizations, meaningful engagement by managed care organizations. You will notice a big difference in this waiver is engagement by the managed care organizations. That's very different, and that is new for many of us. So developing those relationships and really understanding what their role is going to be, how they see this, where does the sustainability look like after the waiver, it's going to be really important. Ongoing program evaluation, mechanisms for accountability is going to be really important, as well as, like I said, building on our existing infrastructure, not duplicating. But most importantly, it's really around communication and collaboration. Okay, what can you do now? Kind of like from a higher level to the organizational level. At the network level, some of you might already be in networks, which is why I had that question polled to you a few minutes ago. Determine where you fit in. Are you already part of a network, IPA, social care network, or even in a not official, legal entity, but who are your natural partners? What are your referral patterns? Who are the groups in your region who are already starting these planning efforts in the waiver? So kind of keep your ears and eyes open about that. Health equity and social care. How does your organization support health equity? Who's your population? How do you do social determinants of health screening? What tools do you use? Do you have tools? What workflows do you have? What services do you provide that meet waiver goals, the health equity goals? How do your services impact the health outcomes that the waiver is looking for? How do you share the results of that work, of that screening? How do you share data across your partners? Do you have new partners that you need to develop relationships with? Now, I recognize that everything I'm giving you right now are all questions. I don't have answers for everything, but there are questions that you and your board and your leadership teams should be thinking about. Workforce being a huge part of this waiver is really important. You need to, obviously, this is probably every single day you're already thinking about this. What are the barriers? What do I need to recruit, retain? Do I need sign-on bonuses? Do I need other training mechanisms? Do I need to address social care needs for my team members? How do I get over any regulatory barriers? What are the regulatory barriers? Scope of practice barriers in my workforce. Sometimes in these waivers, there are other waivers that are available to address a little bit more flexibility in scope of work. We did see that in the last waiver with co-location, et cetera. So we might be looking for that. What are the training and pipeline and recruitment challenges that you have? Who are your training partners? Those kinds of questions. We really need to kind of get to the heart of the workforce challenge. Another polling question, how do you feel about the waiver? Excited, skeptical, worried, or indifferent? Clearly, I am excited about the waiver. I'm cautiously optimistic. I better say that because, again, it's a little bit of a hurry up and wait. But I do think it's an opportunity. We don't have all the details yet, but we definitely want to stay aware of what might be coming. There you go. Stay informed, read the summaries about the waiver, the proposal, whenever the final thing comes out, read that. Participate in these kinds of discussions, ask questions. These kinds of forums and webinars. Start to educate your board. I wouldn't overwhelm your board. I would start very, very high level with a couple of those maybe summary slides and just say, hey, as a leadership team, we are keeping track of this. We are, understanding who our natural networks are. We're understanding what's happening in our region, and we will make sure that we're positioned to take advantage of this opportunity if it does apply to us. And that's another thing you're going to need to do is decide whether this does apply to you and whether it makes sense for your organization to put time and energy into this. Really importantly, understanding your value. What data do you collect? How does that data inform your work? How do you use that data? How do you share that data? How do you measure the impact of your services overall? What is your internal cost structure? Do I need help understanding what my cost structure is and determining what it costs to provide these health-related social needs services? What is the definition of health-related social need? That's going to be really important when this final waiver comes out. How did CMS in New York State land on what is going to be covered? And I'm using the word covered very loosely because this is not an insurance benefit or anything, but what is going to be payable, funded under this model in the social care space. It's going to be really important to look at that closely. We want to make sure we manage expectations for partners so that people don't get sorely disappointed if they're really providing great services, but it's not anything that the waiver is specifying. So that's where we're going to have to be really honest with ourselves in looking at this waiver. And again, reminding ourselves that the waiver is a component part of bigger transformation efforts. How do your services keep people healthy? And ultimately then, how do the payment mechanisms work and how does that apply to how I work and all of my other funding streams? So I think I'm doing okay on time. I do want to just kind of at a very high level summarize a few high level messages. If there's anything you take away from my little bit here, the waiver is an enabler, facilitator, and accelerator. It's not the end all be all. You want to look inward into your organization at your core competencies. How much do those core competencies cost you? How much do your services cost you to provide? Map those services to the waiver. They may map or they may not, but it'll be important to understand how your services relate to the waiver. How do you track data? How do you share data? How do you facilitate understanding of those services? How do you analyze that information, and how do you track their impact? And then also look outwardly, what are happening with all these other networks? How is my region organizing? How do I fit into that organizing? And really just educating your team and your board about the details of the waiver without going overboard. So we're in a balanced stage right now where our region is pretty well advanced in at least organizing ourselves, and that's a double-edged sword because for all we know, the state will come out and it might be completely different than what we just presented on the slides. We don't think it's going to be that different, but there is that possibility. After all, they are negotiating with CMS, and I think Ren is going to be talking next about what's happening kind of across the nation with these waivers.
So Carol, before we transition to Ren,
Yep.
We're 2 for 2 on excellent presentations, including content and presentation. You have gotten a gold star for finishing up a little early. So we're going to ask you 2 questions now.
Okay.
Don't go away because we're going to ask you questions later as well.
Okay.
In my entire 50-year career, any attempts at healthcare reform, collaboration, etc., has involved some degree of segregation and conflict between urban and rural providers. How do you intend, or how do you think we can, in this region, bridge the gap that inevitably has occurred over the last 50 years?
I live it every day, as you know, and the key will be to not slide back. We need to not only build on the existing relationships and tables that we've built over the last at least 8 years, if not longer, at the Common Ground Health Table, for example, at Finger Lakes PPS. We really need to continue those tables and conversations, and we need to bring together as best as possible anything going on in our region, in Monroe County, with the other regions in a way that is respectful, mutually respectful of the needs of the urban and the region, the rest of the region. That, to me, is one of the most important questions that we need to ask ourselves. How are we going to stay together? The most important thing right now is to stay together in naturally occurring referral patterns without a bifurcation of urban and rural. It's a challenge, but we really have to be mindful of the differences in health equity in the city of Rochester and in Monroe County versus down south in Steuben or in Geneva. It's going to be really important that we leverage the similarities and build on that, but also recognize the differences and not try to do the same thing everywhere. But at a core level, some core principles can be maintained at the joint table.
Thank you very much. Before John asks you the second question, I just have to give a little bit of an intro. As most everybody on the call knows, value-based payments, VBP, has been discussed. You mentioned it in your presentation. I think Scott mentioned it. We did get a question in the chat that I think you are in the best position to answer at this point. Over half of the amount of money that we've requested is technically supposed to go to VBP, performance-based payments. And John Miller is now going to ask the skeptical question, which you're going to answer.
Thanks so much.
All right. Do we have any information about whether managed care insurance companies are actually willing to enter into VBP arrangements as anticipated?
Oh, that's the 50%, $7.5 million, what's half of 13 million question. I think that there's a skeptical willingness. I think the key will be, how can they, I'm sure that if I were them, how can I leverage my existing VBP contracts in evolving them to incorporate the things that are in the waiver? But I think the state is going to need to be pretty specific with the managed care organizations on what their guardrails are, what their requirements will be, what the state will be holding them accountable to, and how they expect the managed care organizations and contracting entities to collaborate, operate, and contract. It's not a really good answer. Everybody has their opinion about this. I think it's going to be incumbent on the state and CMS to very clearly define the role of the managed care organization in this waiver.
Thank you. I think everybody agrees, and the folks on the phone will certainly agree, especially the folks that have not been involved in serving Medicaid billing arrangements, that, you know, how much are we going to get paid and how are we going to get paid? And you mentioned don't over expect, but there is a balance here between what could be derived in terms of incentive payments in relationship to how much work is going to have to go into the process. As Danielle transitions over to Ren, thank you, Carol, very much. You got the gold star. I want to just say a few words about Ren Kieber, who is not probably a household name for the over 300 people on the phone. He can be an awesome resource to us in New York. As you know, many of us think that we know it all here in New York, so we rarely look at what's happening in other states. Ren is originally from Naples, New York, I believe, and he was very, very involved in DSRIP and working with flips in that 5-year period. So I believe that while you may not know Ren from a name perspective, I want you to pay close attention to this, because I believe that too often in New York, we try to recreate the wheel and think that we're the only ones that know how to do collaboration and competition at the same time, et cetera. So having said all of that, I do believe that Ren has a very interesting perspective, having been here during DSRIP and also now being mostly in California in terms of resident, but also working in many states around the country. So I would suggest that you pay close attention to his commentary. Ren, you're on.
That's great. Thank you for that introduction, Arch. And there's a very high bar for me now for my next few slides here, as my co-presenters have done such a good job. Arch, thank you again for that overview. I want to add a couple of things to your comments, just so that it kind of frames the content I'll go over here in the next 20 minutes or so. And I've been in healthcare for 15 years, and I've seen now the word health, kind of evolve away from clinical care delivery and more toward health and wellness, and that includes a lot of what in the programs that I'll describe across the country have been transformation efforts using authorities awarded or authorized under an 1115 waiver to integrate more types of services that advance the objective of of putting a wider definition on health in healthcare. And a little bit of what I will go over here is to explain how some other states have deployed transformation programs or demonstrations from authorized under 1115 waivers, but also some other transformation efforts to redesign their Medicaid programs or and other safety net programs to meet those needs in that evolving definition. DSRIP actually started in California and then was emulated in many other states, including New York, as you know from the commentary earlier. I was involved in DSRIP in California back then. There was a major DSRIP initiative in Texas, as well as more recently in Massachusetts. We're going to speak to what Massachusetts is up to lately in the post-DSRIP period. And those are all really focused on steps toward transforming the delivery system for traditional, what I guess we're calling traditional healthcare. Then the latest tranche of demonstration projects approved under 1115 waivers are different. That's why they're not called DSRIP. They are not DSRIP programs. They're bigger than that. They really are starting to transform the term health. And it's in alignment with the new CMS strategic plan. And so it's no surprise that these big projects that are being authorized via waiver authority are looking very different in the past couple of years than they did in maybe the 5 to 8 years prior. And I could never do the CMS strategic pillars justice. If you've heard Chiquita Brooks-LaSure present this in the past, you know what I'm talking about. She is the CMS administrator and does just a wonderful job of describing these pillars. But I think it's important for us to zoom out a bit and take a look at why the programs that we're seeing kicking off now and hopefully soon to be New York kicking off are so much different, and why there's such a focus on approving major investments in Medicaid dollars to include a different set of providers and to transform the way that services as a whole are paid for so that they're sustainable and add value. I'll just read these off very quickly with the intent to get to the next piece of my presentation, which is hopefully going to align some of what CMS is doing with what we're seeing. I've talked already about health equity, and what that means is disproportionate investments in historically underserved communities to correct for that historical underinvestment. And again, I can't do this slide justice like Chiquita Brooks-LaSure can, but nonetheless, you'll see that theme in every waiver that's getting approved. It just doesn't matter what state it is. And equity, disproportionate investment in advancing equity is always a component. And that's no surprise because of the strategic pillar here. Access. Access means different things to different people. Access might mean coverage. Access might be a physical location where services can be provided. And sometimes in the past few years, that's meant technology access, access to services digitally. And so, a lot of what we see, and we'll talk about telehealth and some of the other digital front door investments later, that expanding access is a very multifaceted concept, but nonetheless, is addressed in all the major demonstration projects underway now. And as you know, a large, as Scott mentioned, that's a large component of where New York would like to go for expanding access to social care services. Engaging partners, this is CMS's strategic plan. So what they really mean is engaging CMS partners, being good, better partners to the communities that they serve via policymaking, via what is happening right now between New York and the federal government. At CMS, they're negotiating the current waiver amendment proposal and coming to terms on what it's going to look like for New York. And I think that CMS is committed to engaging meaningfully with their partners, such as state governments, in designing programs that are transformative and achieve their strategic goals. They want to drive innovation. It's long been said that that most of the private/commercial healthcare marketplace, healthcare industry follows CMS's lead, and so they need to take that role seriously and be the driver of innovation that then the rest of the industry can continue to follow. And of course, there's other disruptors in the market right now. If you just go to any healthcare publication, and you'll see lots of headlines around other companies that are disrupting healthcare. But at the end of the day, from a policy perspective, what's regulated, what's allowable, particularly for Medicaid, CMS sets the tone there, and they are getting more innovative. They are approving more. They are approving more transformative efforts that are innovative through waiver approvals. We're going to talk about what Oregon's doing with continuous enrollment. And it really gets to the fact that they're putting their money where their mouth is, at least so far, in approving demonstrations that are innovative, that are very different than the DSRIP or other delivery system transformation programs of the past. They, of course, need to be good stewards of the Medicare Trust Fund and any other dollars that they expend on the Medicaid side. And so this is CMS that covers, Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP. And so we need to make sure that they're being good stewards of public funds. I'm sure that is part of what is happening behind the scenes with the representatives from New York and CMS who are negotiating the waiver approval right now. New York's ask was billions and billions of dollars more than some of the other programs that have been approved. And so understanding budget neutrality and how budget neutrality would be calculated so that we aren't increasing the expenditure, the federal share expenditure of the waiver that are attributed to the waiver programs. There's lots of things that need to go into place to protect public funds as safeguards. And so that's, of course, one of their pillars. And I will say that one of the things that jumps right off the page when you're comparing New York to some of the other programs is the dollar amount of investment. And that's, it's a lot of money to spend in 5 years. And, just the effort there is it looks very, it's on paper, it reads as almost an insurmountable challenge, but they're putting in, an outsized amount of money toward that. And I'm sure that that's a big negotiating point right now. And then, of course, excellence. A lot of this, if you've been following CMS over the years, lightening administrative load, making the rest of the objectives of CMS, more of a well-oiled machine, being a better federal partner, and just kind of raising the bar throughout the centers. Everyone, that's always important. So that's probably, of the strategic pillars on the screen, the one that's maybe least relevant to waiver approvals. Okay, we have a polling question. I was told I could get a little creative with these. So for those of you who heard Arch, I was originally from upstate New York and moved to California about 10 years ago. And how much rain did California receive during our recent atmospheric river storm events the last 3 weeks? Ranging from none, 0 gallons, estimated 24 million, 100 billion, or 32 trillion gallons of water dumped on California.
So Ren, this is Arch. We feel very sad, and you got a lot of support from us in New York, dealing with what you've been dealing with there. But I love this question. I have no idea what the answer is, but I love the question.
I'm glad. I think I can just continue on as folks are.
Yeah, you can keep going.
I will. All right. So what's the buzz in other states? I picked 3 because I do work in these 3 states, and so they're easy for me to speak to. But these aren't the only waivers that have been approved. I also chose these because I think that they are relevant to what New York is proposing. And so I'm going to highlight a couple of these. This is in no way an exhaustive list. CalAIM in California, where we'll start, is, we're still unpacking what that means over the course of the next several years of investment, because they have a lot of staggered start programs. And so I'll start with transforming and expanding whole person care. For those on this presentation who have been following California over the years, the prior waiver, the major component of the prior waiver, which was entitled Medi-Cal 2020, established the whole person care pilots. And those were pilots that had different stewards, but in many ways resembled the proposed SDHNs in New York, meaning that they were largely non-healthcare and they were aligning the organizational partners that rendered, what you might call non-clinical services or social care need services, and also aligned them with behavioral health services and a number of other supportive and wraparound organizations, including housing, and they put in the center of that the human. I don't like to say patient, so that's why it's whole person care, not whole patient care. And so they put the human in the center, and built an infrastructure that shares data about the person, including non-clinical data, and the care management structure that was built to enable whole person care pilots worked very well. Generally, there of course are exceptions to every statement I'm going to make today, but CalAIM is now taking that concept, which was authorized as pilots under Medi-Cal 2020, and expanding that, making them holistic programs. And they're also getting the managed care plans, equivalent to MCOs in New York, they're getting the MCPs to put some skin in the game here, because the whole person care pilots were managed care plans had to be a partner in that, but they largely sat outside the reimbursement flow because they were pilots. CalAIM's investment is to integrate those programs where they exist currently into the to the funds flow for Medi-Cal that's administered by MCPs, much like New York. And then also expand enhanced care management, which is now what we're calling it, into all the counties in the country, or in the state. And so that's a major investment. It's a major programmatic or policy change, but it's one of the bigger headlines coming out of California. And I think that as we get into some of the commonalities on my next slide, there are some commonalities that are applicable to where New York may be going. And then they're also aligning heavily in addressing social care needs. And so out here, we've been calling them under the prior waiver prior waiver and CalAIM, I should say, community supports. And those are being aligned with the vehicles for payment. Payment's now starting to flow through managed care plans, and will continue to, that volume of reimbursement will continue to grow, meaning their global payments are going up to cover some of the additional draws to pay for community supports. And they're also working on integrating referral sources, and predominantly now that's through enhanced care management as those programs get funded and stood up. But ultimately, those referral sources will be, there's no wrong door, is the vision, so that community supports, which are the services themselves, are able to be ordered and rendered and paid for pretty seamlessly for Medi-Cal beneficiaries. Jumping now into the green box, Mass Health in Massachusetts. This is one of the waivers that was more recently approved. It's technically an extension, but it does include now a number of new programs. They're doubling down on value-based payments. They had, if you've been following Massachusetts at all, in their district program, enabled the establishment of accountable care organizations, which were more or less partnerships with managed care plans for payment transformation, and then the district funding was intended to fund the delivery system changes needed to align payment between the managed care organizations and the ACOs. And the ACO is really the concept of the amalgamation of both payer and provider. And they're doubling down on that VBP model. They're now starting to, well, they will start with this new approved waiver extension, redesign primary care payment to start to flow downside risk into primary care through prospective capitated payments. And then the vision there is that there'd be continued integration of some of the HSRA services that would be rendered by community partners that either have CSPs or FSP services. And those are two different legacy programs from the prior waiver that are being continued. And then they're also going to be expanding the definition of HSRA in Massachusetts, and some of the categories that Scott covered. Those are applicable in multiple different states. You start to think about as you start to think about those types of services. The idea here is that the ACO continues to be the conduit through which payment will flow, and they're still, frankly, after 5 years of the prior waiver, still figuring that out. But the intention of the new extension is to now take it a step further and start to integrate more with the HSRA service providers in much the same fashion as the proposal in New York is envisioning SDHNs contracting for services via their CBO network, and then making those services available via referral and payment to the rest of the continuum. And then up in Oregon has been transforming Medicaid forever, and they have an entity model that already takes on delegated risk, financial risk from the Oregon Health Plan, which is the the insurance arm of Medicaid. And the OHP has been working with their CCOs in a number of different projects over a number of different waiver periods. The big headline out of Oregon is less about payment transformation. They actually have a lot of payment transformation already done. Like, they've moved toward delegated risk. They do that model where a provider-led entity, CCO, it's taking risk from Oregon Health Plan and then pays their own claims, and does a number of things to manage the expenditure. So they've been through that. Their focus, and I think the headline that jumped right out to me that I wanted to share today, is continuous enrollment for children up to age 6, from birth to age 6. And so that means that even as the economic conditions of the family change, the kids will be eligible for continuous enrollment without the burden of paperwork. I mean, there will be some paperwork, but it's not an enrollment re-verification for kids up to 6. And then they're also proposing continuous enrollment for young adults up to age 26, and there's a menu of chronic conditions. Obviously, behavioral health diagnoses like SMI diagnoses would be present, and from those conditions being present, they would be also eligible for continuous enrollment up to age 26. And so that's really significant, and I'm going to be watching that. And as I work with clients in Oregon to really understand, well, what does that do for reimbursement, not just for traditional healthcare, but also for payment of HSRA services? And are other states going to start looking to Oregon as a potential model for continuous enrollment? Because there just isn't a lot of that right now. And in fact, we're starting to see a change, the pendulum swinging back from a period where Medicaid enrollment was challenged more and more, it kind of going in the opposite direction of continuous enrollment, right in the pre-pandemic period. Work verification or work requirements, some of the block granting, some of the other things that were kind of the antithesis of continuous enrollment. And so we're starting to see the focus changing, and Oregon's one of the ones that I think is leading that effort. And so it's really it's going to be really interesting to watch that occur. And then they're going to be addressing additional non-clinical service payments into what the CCOs receive as their global capitated payment from Oregon Health Plan. The intention that HRSAs would contract either directly or via an aggregator like an SDHN will do in New York, to pay either on a fee-for-service basis or out of the capitated rate, a sub-capitated amount for some where it's appropriate. There's options as to how. And so it'll be interesting to see how each of the CCOs designs those programs and starts to integrate those services. That said, it's definitely, payment transformation is definitely less of the focus for the new waiver in Oregon. And with that, I want to just jump ahead to some of the commonalities It's a little bit of a busy slide, and in some ways that's intentional, because I put these in no particular order, and it's definitely not exhaustive. But it's in no particular order on purpose because there's really no hierarchy to some of these commonalities. I just really wanted to highlight things that, as I've been working in some of these different markets, I've seen being the trends, and these are also the ones that align well with what New York is proposing. And I'm focusing mostly on the social care integration into healthcare, as well as behavioral health transformation. But that said, I want to just call out the word continuum that's on this slide multiple times. And I actually started putting it in quotes because, when I, as a kind of traditional healthcare guy, think of the continuum, it really goes from the primary care provider's office up through acute care and specialists, and then into home health and subacute and some of the other. It's very, very healthcare focused. And you still use the term continuum, but a lot of the Medicaid transformation efforts is really redefining what continuum means, kind of going back to my opening comment about the changing definition of health. And so the commonalities that I see in a lot of these programs that address, that are really starting to address the continuum. And so just highlighting some of these commonalities on the screen, integration of HRSN into the continuum, making sure that they're an integral part and not an afterthought. And so there's some major investments, and New York would be, leading the pack if the level of funding they are hoping for gets approved. They'd be leading the pack in really making it, entirely financially irresponsible to not integrate social support services into the continuum of healthcare payment and delivery. And that's really important because, so much of the demonstration funding is associated with getting the work done, but the long-term vision is that these programs are sustainable, long after the demonstration period, paid out of Medicaid premiums, that's administered by the state. And so, to that end, they need to be integrated into the continuum. Same goes for behavioral health in different states or at different places in their behavioral health journey. California is both an innovator and also kind of a laggard when it comes to behavioral health. And there will be another waiver probably in 2024 that will sit in the CalAIM bundle, but really focused on transforming behavioral health services and integrating into the continuum. For those that work in the behavioral health space, how frustrating it is that sometimes the conditions that affect the brain that have behavioral health implications are handled both from a payment and delivery system way differently from physical element of the brain, like some terrible aneurysm or something, right? It's entirely carved out, and so that's a continued focus. And again, California has been doing some carving in. And in some ways that's innovative, but health insurers, not just Medicaid and managed care, but managed care in general, have started to realize that treating behavioral health services separately and carving them out makes no sense. And so, some of the carve outs that occurred in the late 90s and early 2000s, and even into the earlier Affordable Care Act implementation period are now being carved back in. And there's a lot of headlines around that. They're starting to manage that premium alongside the rest of the premium. That concept applies in some of these demonstration programs, which there's incentive funding to transform that payment and delivery so that it is much more comprehensive or complementary, and they're part of the continuum going forward. And, Carol mentioned that in the co-location waiver from earlier. That's a baby step, and some of the true integration of behavioral health services into the continuum of both payment and delivery is a theme in these waivers that are getting approved. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about data, and then I want to talk about payment. So you can see two data boxes on here: infrastructure to enable human-centric care across the continuum, and data sharing to enable reporting and measurement. And so, as different provider types that are not traditionally considered part of the healthcare ecosystem, even though they perhaps should have been historically, as they get integrated, how does that create a human-centric or a person-centric care model that employs to the best use it possibly can all this new continuum? And so infrastructure could mean any number of things. It could mean the ability to bill a Medicaid plan for a non-clinical service where there are no historical or procedure or revenue codes associated with that. It could mean that there's infrastructure to exchange data. That's what informs data sharing to enable reporting and measurement. There's lots of different things that go into that. Its infrastructure can also mean shared services, and I'm going to talk briefly about what I think is coming down the pike related to shared services for person-centered care. That really all helps inform continued alignment of payment with impact, and often that's pretty much value-based payment. And value-based payment means different things to different people. Sometimes to some people it means risk transfer. Some people it means just pay for performance. I'm still going to be paid for all of my services on a fee schedule, but if I do those services really well and I expand capacity to the point where I'm meeting my client demand, and I get a bonus check. So value-based payment means different things to different people, but it is a commonality because payment transformation is the only way that some of these demonstration programs authorized under a waiver become sustainable and become part of the DNA of the Medicaid system in the future. And we know that there's strength in numbers. I mean, healthcare providers, traditional healthcare providers figured that out years ago. Strength in numbers, either through M&A or through networks or through some alignment vehicle. And that concept needs to be applied to the rest of the providers, not only in the traditional healthcare continuum, but in the recast continuum in a post-waiver period. And so, you're following some kind of logic to my madness of this slide, where these things are fairly interrelated. I'm talking very briefly about some of the other things. More front doors. I mentioned this earlier. Ultimately, the vision for many of these transformation efforts is that in order to advance health equity, it means that there needs to be no wrong door to access care, whatever the form care may take, and that includes digital. That sometimes means procuring for an underserved population the means to access care via a digital front door. Make an appointment at their library. Making sure that all of the right controls are in place so that they're compliant to do that. There's a lot of things that California is doing related to the kind of no wrong door concept, where there's integration across more so when enhanced care management is fully deployed, but integration across the entire public sector, such that there are very few wrong doors and ultimately no wrong door. I talked briefly about disproportionate investment in advancing health equity. I'll serve with that. All of them have a public health emergency wind down component. Different states are handling the PHE wind down period differently, but all of the more recent approvals have included a PHE wind down component. Scott talked a little bit about where New York is thinking of going relative to the PHE wind down. And then while I am no expert in housing, it's important to include the fact that housing is becoming maybe the most important social risk factor as it pertains to health outcomes. We could probably have a debate of the folks on this webinar, what's the most important, but it doesn't matter really, because housing is really important. And to that end, almost all of the waivers include some housing a component to integrate either capacity building, because that's constantly capacity issues, the ability to partner better with the healthcare ecosystem to identify need earlier and make referrals earlier, and then to address, in California in particular, address the just insurmountable backlog related to folks who need housing services, and under the entire umbrella of housing services, that need is very large across all those different stratifications of those that have housing needs. So I will go on to my next polling question here, number 6. So the CMS definition of HRSN. What does HRS stand for according to CMS? So his red skinny necktie, which when I wrote this, I thought I was going to be wearing my red tie, and I can't find it. So there's that. Health-related social need. The splash new book, Henry's Royal Story Narrative. Or maybe a new innovative intervention for depression management, and SNFs, habitual reading for seniors in nursing.
So Ren, here at Mission Control, we looked up the Google answer to your water question. And is it correct to say $32 million, 32 trillion gallons?
There it is. That's the
All right. Well, I didn't get it right. So I wanted everybody to know that you guys have been deluged You should have had, who was it? Moses? Who was the guy that split the, and anyway, go ahead. You got about 4 minutes to 5 minutes left, if you don't mind.
I will wrap it up.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, it was an enormous amount of water, I will say that. So what can an organization in New York expect? That kind of drew, again, in no way intended to be exhaustive, really meant to be thought-provoking. If nothing else, these are themes, and maybe in some ways complements or builds on or helps add color to what Carol concluded with about, how can you fit in? What are the considerations, and kind of roughly categorize these into organizational, programmatic. Programmatic, might be, cross-cutting organizational, right? Programmatic things might be, we have certain programs, we have different partners, it's thematic to the service offerings of the organization. Whereas organizational is, what's our revenue, what's our costs, what's the governance model? And so that's kind of roughly how I divided these up, and I'll just rattle these off and take a moment to stop and highlight some of the ones I think are important given what is happening across the country. Expanded or redefined governance. That occurs whenever there's transformation, so that's no surprise. But something to be thinking about related to the organizational transformation. Accelerated consolidations. I like to tell the story where I described whole person care in California, and some of the whole person care pilots resulted in the consolidation of social care providers, given the fact that they just suddenly had a huge influx of referrals that they needed to service. There needed to be consolidation on the organizational kind of back office functions that needed to be scaled up aggressively in order to meet the demand of these incoming referrals. And so it results in a lot of consolidations, and we've seen consolidations in other markets as a result of waiver transformation work, such as in Texas and in Massachusetts. And there is some emerging study around what the impact of consolidations means to the cost of delivering some of these services and the ability to draw down dollars related to grant programs. Bigger organizations get bigger grants. That's kind of outside the waiver, but it's something to consider from an organizational perspective. And consolidations doesn't necessarily mean mergers in a strict sense. It's a step beyond alignment. We say we partner or we say we align, but consolidation could mean financial integration, so that you're able to set set pricing in a way that's compliant with any of the legal concerns related to from the federal and state regulators on setting prices for some of these services. There's lots of considerations to understanding where consolidation, whatever form that may take, could be helpful. I say aggressive capacity building, and aggressive is an aggressive word. We need to build capacity at a rate that is going to be unprecedented, and that there's a million things behind this bullet that's super important to understand how to be successful at capacity building. There's change management, there's demand forecasting, and there's all of the workforce issues I'll talk about on the other box. Lots of things that go into that. But the point is, the level of investment that New York is intending to make, pales. It makes the other waiver programs that I just described kind of pale in comparison. And so to achieve some of these goals, goals that will be ultimately in the agreement between the state and the CMS and the special terms and conditions will require some really transformative work across the new continuum to increase capacity. Development of shared services, one of the ways to enable capacity building, having a willingness to build with each other and buy from each other. When I'm working in a very traditional healthcare project, we sometimes hear organizations say, whoever has the data has the power, whoever has the service has control over things. There needs to be, for this to be successful, some consideration of how to break down those walls and understand if we work together, if we build shared services, if we don't reinvent the wheel, there's an opportunity for us all to reduce the costs of delivering the services that we collectively want to offer, and make sure that the outcomes that we want can be properly measured without having to take a temperature read to do measure calculation in 4 or 5 different places. A measure from healthcare, a measure from social care, a measure from public health. If we build shared services, particularly for anything that results in efficiencies on costs, that's really important. And then changing revenue generation. I talked a lot about VBP already. I won't talk about that again. And I know that I'm at time, so I'll just zip through the programmatic box here. I tend to be a little provocative by saying competitors may become your partners, or someone who is currently your partner may become your competitor. And the objective here is to maximize your impact. And so be ready for that, because it invariably happens in every transformation effort. There may be new or new to you responsibilities because you're starting to handle different types of dollars and funding and different types of data. And some of those data elements have strings attached to them for compliance. You may have new things to learn there. You may actually, need to set up a compliance office that has a couple of people in it that you never needed before. Workforce challenges. We talked a little bit about, rural versus urban. In Carol's talk, the workforce challenges are never going to go away, period. We just have to continue to figure out how to get around them. Attracting, retaining, redeploying, career ladder. In New York, I know that the WIOs are going to have a role there. In other states or other mechanisms to start to address the workforce challenges, I will say no state has figured it out yet, and that's evident if you look at some of the headlines in media related to the healthcare and human services workforce challenges in particular. And then programmatically, just be ready for budget uncertainty, changing forecasts, ever-changing requirements. Defining and then redefining key terms, because the term definition at the beginning of the waiver period might get changed because there was an oversight body that came in and said it actually means this, and the way you've been using that term is wrong, and so the whole state has to change how they think about a key term, and so those are just things to be ready for and expect as part of this transformation process. That happens everywhere. With that, I think I'm a couple of minutes over, but I apologize for that. I'll hand it back over to Perch.
Ren, we are now 3 for 3 with excellent presentations, which lowers my standard because I can still fail and will still be 3 for 4. I hope that as we go through this presentation, this was designed for you all to give to your boards and your management teams. Many of you know that I'm a David Letterman fan. And as a David Letterman fan, I do everything in a top 10 list, but most of mine are not humorous. So 10 practical strategies for providers to consider. If you go to the next slide, you all can read these. I'm not going to read them to you, but anybody that knows me knows that most people refer to me as a bleeding heart liberal on the social side of the spectrum. I am a fiscal moderate, I will say, but I will be the first to admit that I am a social liberal. And much of what you hear from me is because I look at healthcare through my own lens. The first 3 speakers have their own lens of how they look at healthcare. I think we're generally in not necessarily full alignment, but generally in alliance. And I do believe that that 3rd bullet is very important. Trust and confidence. And the 4th bullet, competition while avoiding unnecessary duplication of services is something that we have not been very good at. I'm going out for a blood draw this afternoon. I have doctors at both Rochester Regional Health and Strong. Last time I went for a blood draw, the people at Rochester Regional told me even though I had 2 appointments the following week, I had to go get blood drawn from Strong Lab as well as from Rochester Regional. That to me seems like unnecessary duplication of services because my blood's not going to change in a matter of a couple of days. Next slide. So I'm going to go through these quickly because we got some great questions that we're going to go through. So I encourage you to stay on until 3 o'clock. We will be done at 3 o'clock. So you can read these. I'm not going to read them to you. At the end of the slide presentation for me, there are descriptions of what evidence-based practice involves. This is something that has been very, very common in the medical service delivery system for many years, but not something that's as well known for community-based organizations, social support providers. So I think you want to educate yourself in that regard. Not that evidence-based practice is necessarily going to fit perfectly for a social support organization, but the idea is to achieve the most cost-effective model and site of care and achieving designated quality metrics. The last bullet, I am very, very, very want to emphasize this a lot, and that is When we get this approved, which I fully believe we will, I do believe there will be incremental revenue to come, but as one of the questions that's already been asked, the state and the MCOs are going to be critical to whether or not a significant amount of money comes out to providers through VBP. And as you know, CBOs, as we'll say on the next slide, do not have a lot of experience. In some cases, do not have any experience in billing Medicaid for services, and they are receiving their reimbursements from other sources. Next slide. So if you do not bill Medicaid right now, what is it that we need to do? You have to understand that the insurance companies don't understand social support organizations very well. They understand what a food bank is. They understand what a transportation provider is, but they don't really understand where you get your funding from. So this integration of CBOs through the form of social determinant of health networks, along with behavioral health, along with primary care, and with health systems, is a very, very heavy lift. So as you look at yourself in the social support arena, I believe that there's a fair amount of education that you need to do at your own level with, again, providing this document to your board and perhaps some of the other presenters. But keep in mind that as we go through this process and we get to the contracting stage, we may be in a position where you're going to be asked, what exactly do you do and how do you get paid? Because MCOs are not accustomed to working with community-based organizations or social support. North Carolina, if you want to go to their website, does have a fee schedule that they've developed in connection with their waiver that does have payment rates for delivery of certain social support functions, like a bag of dinner or items for food from a food bank. Delivering for a family of 4 equates to a certain fee. So that would be something you want to probably take a look at as well. I do believe that your next step, if you're in the CBO arena, is to continue to pay attention to how this is going to develop. We'll know a lot more, hopefully, by April 1 as to whether or not the separate allocation of value-based payments to social determinant of health IPAs, that will be a key element of the approval process, which I believe is partially in the application, but you're still going to be dealing with managed care organizations who may or may not be familiar with how they should be rewarding you for, quote, performance-based metrics. Next slide. So just to recoup or recap some of what you've heard from the previous 3 presenters. I've been around for 50 years. We have tried reform in healthcare really starting aggressively in the 80s. After Medicare and Medicaid were passed by Congress in 1965, it took 15 years basically for the government to realize that cost-based reimbursement for healthcare services was not exactly the best model for purposes of reimbursing Medicare and Medicaid. So we have been focused on integrated care coordination and service delivery. Back in the 80s and 90s, it was IDNs, integrated delivery networks. These acronyms are things that you want to be aware of: MCOs, IPAs. We haven't mentioned CCOs yet, but care coordination organizations are specifically for the IDD population. Health homes have been developed as care coordination primarily for behavioral health individuals, both mental health and substance abuse. Accountable care organizations were formed by Obamacare back in 2012. Those require a health system, either as a lead or a primary leader, for purposes of entering into both Medicare and as well capitated relationships with insurance companies. Next slide. So can we collaborate and compete at the same time? Yes, is the answer from this bleeding heart social liberal. But New York has been protected for my entire career and longer, where we do not have any for-profit hospitals. you want to go down to Florida and see the impact of for-profit versus nonprofit hospitals. Doesn't take long when you get there. We are subject to disruptors coming into New York State. I think CVS buying Aetna was a first step in the direction. Walmart setting up walk-in medical care centers. There's plenty of things that are out there that need to be we need to be aware of, because we're not living in a insulated state any longer and will not be going forward. We cannot forget antitrust regulations, but understand that there are safe harbors. So if somebody starts taking you down an antitrust rabbit hole, understand that federal and state regulators do want integration of collaborative organizations that are also competing with one another. And I do believe that one of the areas that could be viewed as an opportunity for savings is the number of urgent care centers. I was just in Florida a few weeks ago, and I could not believe the number of urgent care walk-in care centers that existed there. So just remember, again, boycotts and anti-competitive structures will always be verboten. So we want to make sure as we come together and collaborate, let's not start thinking about being anti-competitive in our activities as it relates to dealing with either the MCOs or the government. Next slide. So IPAs, you heard a lot about this earlier from a couple of the presenters. It used to be independent provider associations or independent practice associations, largely formed by physicians and licensed professionals, social workers, chiropractors, et cetera. And that's what we had during the 70s, 80s, 90s. And when the ACOs came into play, and prior to ACOs, the hospital systems developed their own IPAs. In the Rochester area, we have GRIPA, and we have, Accountable Health Partners at Strong and Rochester Regional. So this structure of an IPA has been reformatted now to involve provider organizations above and beyond physicians. And it does work very well. And there are regulations in New York that give certain safe harbors to IPAs. So again, don't get yourself too focused on antitrust issues, because the state does want us to do what we're suggesting here. We can't ignore them, but it's not a rabbit hole that we want to spend a lot of time on unless we start talking about things that would be viewed as illegal by either state or federal folks. We have, as indicated earlier, primary care IPAs, behavioral health IPAs, and a developing group of social determinant of health IPAs. So that leads you to the next slide. Are we going to question, I'm sorry, go back one. Are we going to join one or more IPAs? And I believe that, as I indicated in the second bullet here, it is going to be strategically appropriate for you not to be exclusive to one IPA in the early stages of this model, but one or more. But don't join everybody just for the sake of joining everybody. You have to take a strategic look at what's the value to your organization of belonging to a particular regional network in the form of an IPA. Next slide is a polling question. How many words were in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address? Less than 150, 150 to 350, 350 to 550, or 550 words. We'll move on. Let me answer my questions so that I can move on here quickly. Lincoln was a man of few words, I'll tell you that. What will MCOs and ACOs pursue in terms of forming regional participating provider networks? So we've got a number of IPAs out there. How they're going to collaborate with one another is going to be one of the key elements of the next year to 18 months, assuming that we get approval. And as you know, up till now, the state has told MCOs that they can only contract in the VBP world with organizations that have a primary care complement of physicians and nurse practitioners and, if you will, mid-level providers. I already gave you the example on blood draws. There will be inherent competing objectives once you sit at a table with the the board of an IPA or in a member meeting of 200 providers in an SDH. We have to understand that each of you are looking through a different lens as well. The lens most people are looking through is how do I maintain fiscal viability, sustainability, and fulfill the mission for my organization versus the collective group of members that might be involved in the IPA. So it is important that as we look at MCOs and ACOs, right now it's focused on primary care. I do believe the integration of primary care, behavioral health, and social support organizations in an ideal world, in my utopian view, we would get all those organizations working together either contractually or through a governance model that would share control and service, that organization would be in a position to contract directly with the MCOs that are going to be controlling the value-based payment bucket. Next question, next slide. Okay, I keep getting my pop-ups here. Go. All right, so the other thing that you need to realize is that when you start sitting at tables with others, and I understand everybody's been collaborating with somebody for the entire career of the last 50 years, this is collaboration at an Uber level. Again, on a regional basis, dozens, if not hundreds of providers. The first physician IPA in the Rochester area had 2,200 physicians in it in a 9-county area. So there is really no limit, if you will, to the regions that an IPA can cover. And you need to understand that as well with respect to how you're joining and who you're joining in terms of an IPA. We are in a position where the participation in an IPA network will result in improved communication, collaboration, familiarity, and ultimately what the state of New York wants is alignment and affiliation to take advantage of technology advancements, and that in their minds right now that best can be accomplished through affiliations, mergers, and providers working together. We're the last of 2 industries that have not gone through the consolidation effort of retail and banking and the other industry sectors, airlines, et cetera. I mentioned CVS and Aetna earlier, and that's really one of the major steps, in my opinion. The other one was Centene out of Missouri buying Fidelis a couple years back. We've got Molina out of California coming into New York State. Those are both 2 huge Medicaid managed care plans that we have not necessarily had to deal with before. I think each of them have more than 2 million Medicaid subscribers. Next slide.
We got 9 minutes.
7?
9 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to finish this up and then we're going to go to questions. Thank you. So be at every table. My term now is strategic positioning. You cannot plan 5 years out in strategic planning any longer. You got a 3-year plan and you got to update it every 12 months. That's my point number 3 in the bullet. Do it by, if you will, June of 23 in terms of either updating or revisiting both your SWOT analysis and your strategic positioning. And you will have to, as I like to say, you should stay at every table you can be at until they ask you for a check. Once they ask you for a check, you got to do a cost-benefit analysis as to whether you want to join that organization or not. MCOs and ACO participation are 2 separate paths, but both of them need to be evaluated as cost-benefit. Next one. Okay, so if this webinar is your first substantial exposure, you're going to start strategic positioning on Monday. We've said this before, but we'll say it again. This is not DISRIP 2.0 or 3.0. This is a new model that really does try to achieve a utopian view of integrated care collaborative across multiple competitors in multiple lines of business. You should establish a team of management level individuals to evaluate your approach. And this is really, really focused on social support organizations. You have not had to do this in the past. And then find the path forward that results in the most, if you will, benefit to your organization. I say incremental revenue here, but the other benefit here is you can improve your mission and fulfillment of your mission and your outcomes by participating actively in this program. And then my last slide, As a shameless plug, I think the 4 people you've heard from today can be helpful to you. We're there to help you, and we want to help you. We do not represent MCOs or ACOs, and I think it's important for you to understand that it is important for you to reach out when appropriate to the folks that can provide you with a level of assistance that you might require. With that, I'm going to turn it over to John Miller for our Q&A period. Thank you.
Okay. All right. The first question is, the last 3 states that have been approved for waivers did not include a hero structure. What is your prediction on whether CMS will approve this waiver with the hero structure in place?
Direct that to Ren.
That's to Ren. And Ren, the follow-up on that is, if not a hero structure, who will do all of this stuff?
Sure, good question. I think I'll comment on just my perspective, but then the other panelists might have some thoughts. The waivers that got approved recently, correctly don't have kind of the separate concept for coordination and regional planning that the hero is in the New York waiver. But the reason I think that it was excluded in those recent approvals is that there was existing infrastructure, existing organizations, I should say, that were cited as the vehicles for additional investment. So the ACOs in Massachusetts, they were already doing a lot of the work related to the traditional healthcare system transformation under district, which is now ended for them. The new waiver starts to include social care services, build on the ACO structure, and adding another organization into that mix probably wasn't the right move, and so it wasn't part of their application. That leads me to believe that there probably will include that a hero concept in the approval, because I think it would be hard to answer the question, the second part of that question, of who's going to do the work if it's excluded. And so the other waivers had some vehicle to handle administration of all the work being proposed. New York is proposing a waiver that would need a level of regional planning for it to be successful. And in the absence of that, I would, I don't know the answer for who would do it if the heroes were not approved. I think each region might have some kind of organization that can help with administration and regional planning, but that's not going to be true of all the regions in New York. And so that's why I think it was included.
Carol, you got 45 seconds. I know you want to comment.
No, I agree with Ren. I think the intent is, if there are already established capacity tables, planning efforts that have been going on for years or decades, I would imagine that that CMS would recognize that in that particular state.
Yeah, and I will say, New York's did not say need to be a new co, so it's not necessarily creating new structure for the hero.
The next question I have is, why is it taking so long to get this approved? We submitted in September. Now we're looking at April. These other states that Ren mentioned were approved during the interim period.
Yeah.
I think it's the enormity of the ask. All of the other ones were single-digit billions. So we're way in excess of that in the ask. So I think it's largely financial. I think the budget neutrality calculation is going to be a big headache for the feds in the state. I think that the complexity of the ask and the amount of dollars is causing the delay.
All right, a question for Scott. When we look at the hero structure and the SDHN structure, what is the timeline after the hero structure gets created to start creating these SDHNs and have the CBO involvement? It would seem that they need to first start looking at integrating, such as IT, compliance, and other shared services before they know to get to the SDHN. What are your thoughts on that and the timeline?
Good question. So I think the timeline is one that we're still kind of looking at. If you look at some speculation around procurement process, funding that is allocated right now, as far as the first year, it appears to be a procurement process that would probably be a 6-month window. Both of those seem to be, from all knowledge that I've seen, happening simultaneously. Certainly the HERO and the SDHN will be working closely together, but as far as I can tell, the SDHN is not being decided upon by the HERO. They are two separate things that will be working hand in hand, but not dependent upon each other as far as HERO chooses SDHN for the region itself. Two separate procurement processes, two separate entities with the leads. Timeline as far as how they continue to flesh themselves out, still yet to be seen. More on that once approval happens and we get the fun things, the special terms and conditions that, again, nerds like me get to read through on vacations. Time, go.
Okay, Scott, because you said you've read through this and nerds like you read through this. So a follow-up question, Governor Hochul has said she, in her budget initiatives, is big on affordable housing and mental illness. Also, when you read the waiver, it discusses housing. And in your presentation, you made a reference to transitional housing. Can you state what transitional housing is versus other forms of affordable housing? 45 seconds, and Arch is going to wrap up in 2 minutes, and we'll get everyone out of here by 3:01.
Sure. Sure. So it's certainly supportive versus transitional, affordable, unaffordable, things like that is certainly not part of the conversation necessarily. It is much more about timeline, longevity, time needed for said transitions, things along that. Affordable housing is a completely different conversation in the context of what we were getting at between supportive and transitional. Yeah, more there, but essentially affordable is a different conversation altogether.
Okay, Carol, we're coming up on our hour here. Can you take 1 minute to summarize whatever you want to say, and then I'll do the same thing with Ren. Scott already had his minute when answering those last two questions.
Sorry, my alarm just went off. Yeah, I think, not to repeat what I said earlier, but this is another vehicle, enabler, facilitator, accelerator to work that we've already started. Let's not recreate the wheel. Let's leverage what we already have in our communities. Be aware of who's organizing, understand what your natural networks are, and just keep yourself aware. Don't lose sleep over this, but just keep yourself aware of what's going on. And then when the thing comes out, take some time to read it. A little trick that I do is if there's a particular area I'm interested in, I just do a word find on the 75-page document and see where my particular service shows up in the waiver, and then kind of go at it from there. Take it bit by bit. It can be overwhelming. That would be kind of my summary.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Ren for final comments. We do have one last polling question here. Georgia Bulldogs repeating next year for a three-peat, yes or no? And Ren, you got the last minute, the last word.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to echo what Carol said, because there's a lot that we don't know. There are more questions than there are answers right now. And so, hopefully what we've shared today provides an overview. Each of us have kind of come at the waiver with our different lenses, as Arch said. I think that in the end, we do still have to wait for what the final approval looks like. And Carol, you alluded to this, that, it could look a little bit different than what the proposal was. And so, know who your partners are, start to understand how you might fit in, visualize yourself, in the future state, and then wait, for the actual framework to come out, and then you'll be better prepared to work within that. So thank you for the time today, and to my panelists, colleagues. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all.
Very well done, and we'll continue with some webinars as we go forward here. Hopefully the next one will be after we get approval. Thank you all very much. And again, 3 for 3 on the excellent panels presentations. So have a good weekend, everyone, and stay dry out there in California, Ren.
Okay.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.